is the difference between faith and grace?
Well, the I bring it up as a little bit of an aside, just to say that people have sort of the same that they have with faith being emphasized over works. They have that with grace over works or man's will or whatever it is. It's sort of this. It's almost exactly the same problem. I mean, um, the there's a difference in that faith is generally considered something that is predominantly on the side of the believer, whereas grace is something that's on the side of God. Um, but in this case, they function in the same way um, where the grace of God is said to be sort of the prime actor and the thing that allows all of our efforts at working alongside come to actual fruition. It's sort of God that sets the stage, God that allows that cooperation to happen, and then God who um, makes us creatures who are capable of cooperation. So, uh, but it comes around to the same point where sort of people worry about faith because it can breed inactivity or just sort of a complacent attitude. And then on the other side, people worry about the doctrine of grace for the same reasons. They think that um, if people, if it's all put on God, if God's sort of the primary one uh, responsible, more or less, then that'll bring about the same complacence. So it's just an echo of the same problem, at least through this lens, though they are different. Faith is for the person's mindset, the story that determines the person's mindset and how they see themselves, and then their actions, and then grace is the activity of God.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So there is that difference between grace and faith. Um, would you say that the initial invitation would then come from the individual to harbor that faith, then to accept the grace from God? Or do you think that God could supplies his grace to the faithless as well?
I think I know what you're saying, but could you say it again?
Yep. So coming from the point of faith being kind of the individual, kind of the human aspect, and then God brings his grace upon those that have faith. My question would be, and I think of let's say David, for example, in the Bible in the Old Testament, who didn't necessarily do everything that God had asked him to do. There were certain things that he did that many modern Christians would probably say weren't very good, but nonetheless, God supplied David with his grace. Would you say that's in general that God supplies grace to people, even those that don't have faith, or do you think that those that kind of live in a Christ-like fashion that follow Christ, then is kind of the initiating aspect for then God to bring that grace down upon those that have faith?
Yeah, I see. So I mean, it's a little bit of both. I think the traditional answer that we're well accustomed to in like the Western, especially Protestant world, is that it's all God's grace and it's God's grace before everything else. But um, part of the problem is that we're thinking of things in sort of a linear order, and we're thinking about what comes first, meaning time wise, like do I do my action first or does God do his action first? But God is not a being bound by time. So assuming that time applies to him giving grace and he only gives it like at this certain period after or before something is, I think, just a non-existent reality. Like that's it's the frame in which it's presented is preventing uh, a perception of what's actually going on. And so, um, and then to hypothesize without, oh, well, if we look at God's side without time, then we're just shooting in the dark, sort of. So you could speculate that, well, God sort of is always um, sending out his grace, and then we experience it in varying times in our lives. But I think that I like that description, but I have no way of knowing whether that is the reality or not. And so the question is right from the perspective that we are always going to look from our perspective. And so um, it's just we tend to take the question a little bit uh, literally and mechanically and think that it says something about God, but really we're saying something about our experience as humans, and we have a time bound experience. And I would say that I think that there have been people who have experienced it either way. Some people will sort of be called to action, and you might say, well, that call itself is the initial grace. Maybe, again, it's sort of splitting hairs, like where do you draw the line? What's God's grace? What's not? But um, some people will lead with action and then come to believe, as we were talking about earlier, like sometimes you have to enact a new habit in the hope that your mindset will change through being exposed to that different style of life. I think that is true, and I think that has worked for some people. Other people have the mindset shift first, which you might call a grace that just sort of like comes out of nowhere. It's just an insight or a moment of clarity that's bestowed on you through nothing that you can sort of point to, of like, I was cultivating this, or I was asking for this, or whatever. It just sort of happens. And then from that point, their activity reorients itself. So I don't know that I don't think there's an answer to, like, from our perspective, which is the only perspective that it's appropriate to think about this, what came first. It's kind of, it depends on the person and depends on the activities of their life. And I don't think that either side, is an untenable position that says something, makes a problem with theology or God's goodness or anything like that. So I think you can go either way.